Hello ladies and gentlemen. Last time we sculpted the legs on Kronos. We pretty much got them to a place where I'm willing to leave them for now and frankly probably forever, with the exception of some subtle texture work which we'll do at the end of the project when everything else is done, right before we'll make a mold of the figure. Today we'll continue in a similar vein, but instead of legs, we will be sculpting arms. But before all of that, let me make a little announcement. Mitch Shea, the director of the sculpture program at the Florence Academy of Art, and myself are holding a little workshop on figurative sculpture. The workshop will be held from July 27th to August 7th at the Florence Academy of Art, Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. or 9 to 16 if you prefer the 24-hour system. We'll be teaching you how to sculpt a half life-size figure from life and a 3/4 life-size torso as well. Just to be clear, this is an in-person workshop, so you have to be able to make it to Florence in order to participate. These spots are very limited, so be quick on the draw here. I'll leave a link at the top of the description below the video. You can also shoot me an email if you have any questions, of course. I'll leave my email address in the description below as well. And I hope to see you there. Let's start this video off with the why. Why do the arms now? And frankly, to be honest, it's a bit of a mistake. Ultimately, I don't think that it will matter too much, but it is a bit of a mistake. So, the reason it is a mistake is because whenever you have elements like the arms and the head, in this case, interacting with each other, you should sculpt the one that's the least forgiving and flexible first. Now, the arms are a lot freer to move than the head. So, I should have started with the head. Get the head in the correct position, and then move on to the arms, and you can move and adjust the arms to interact properly with the head. So, why did I do the arms first? Well, to be honest, I think I just kind of forgot. I didn't think it through properly, and didn't think it through as well as I should have. However, always keep in mind that whenever we're sculpting anything, as long as we're sculpting in clay, it's just clay, and nothing here is permanent until the sculpture gets molded. So, at the end of the day, it's not a big deal as long as I'm willing to make changes to the arms, even if it means moving backwards a little bit whenever I get the head up there in case the arms don't fit the head. Okay then, so why the arms so late in the game? Why now? Why not the arms before the legs, for example? Well, the arms are thin, especially at this scale, which means they'll dry out faster than a thicker section like the legs. I always think and try to sculpt from inside out in every imaginable way. This also means that I start with the core of the figure before slowly progressing outwards towards the limbs. By first establishing what's most important in order for the figure to function on a structural level, and what's important in that equation is the core of the figure, I limit the amount of rethreading I have to do and how major eventual backtracking ends up being. As I just mentioned, and you've probably heard before if you've seen any of my videos before, I'm working from inside out. Not only from the core outwards towards the limb, but also from the armature out towards the skin, towards the surface of the skin. What I'm not attempting to do is to address every anatomical feature that lies beneath the surface of the arm. I'm not sculpting the bones, I'm not sculpting the muscles that do not appear on the surface as forms. So, it's not simply an anatomical approach to sculpture. Because the arms are so narrow, there isn't a lot of time to develop them as I sculpt, which is what I do with the body. I take my time with the body, and I can explore for a long time because the body is wide and allows me time to test things out, test the contours out, for example. How the contours move in space. The legs are thinner, more narrow than the body, but still, the legs are a lot thicker than the arms. Because of the narrow nature of the arms, the way the contours of the arms move must be established earlier more aggressively. If I had more space to work with, I could make the beginning contours a lot straighter, essentially place them in the wrong place before adjusting the direction of the contours as I progress, as long as I work from inside out. So I'm not at the surface while addressing the contours. That happens below the surface. If you attempt to do this, however, with the arms, you'll often end up with sausage arms. Arms that are very round and very simple. They will lack accuracy, and no one will ever take note or interest in arms sculpted this way. In general, it's a bad way to sculpt, so make sure that your contours move in space. There is some freedom because the way many contours move in space is not so easy to observe. So part of it is up to you and at your discretion. You'll also find that once you evaluate how you prefer to sculpt contours, you'll realize that it's a large part of the style of your sculpture. A bit of a trademark in a sense, and something that usually can't be easily replicated by others because it's a rather subtle thing and most people can't even see it. Just like most people won't notice or can't see it on a regular person. But they can feel it in a sculpture, and a sculpture with contours moving in space well will always stand out compared to one without contours moving well in space. Now, by moving well in space, I am talking about how the contours move in depth when observing from one view. From one view, you can only observe contours on a flat two-dimensional level, but the contours you observe to be moving on a flat 2D plane still have to move in 3D. So we must introduce this movement, and it's best to introduce it by observing from a different view. That different view would be 90 degrees to the original view that you observed from. This brings me to observing on equal terms. When observing the contours around the pelvis, or the box, we observe directly from the front of the pelvis, and from there 90 degrees to either side and from the back, so 180 degrees from the original view. So 4 views in total. If the rib cage isn't rotated on top of the pelvis, we can observe it from the same 4 views. Sometimes the arms might be easily observed from these 4 views as well. Now, in my case, however, this won't work. Notice how the arms are at an angle. Let's take the left arm, for example. The elbow is pushed out from the body. So in order to observe this arm from the side view, I must get on a stool and look down at it. If I don't do this, I'll be looking at a foreshortened arm with the elbow coming towards me, the elbow being closer to me than the shoulder. I don't want to do this. This will create a whole host of issues. The back and the front view are fine. I can observe those from ground level, from the front and the back. The inside of the arm cannot be observed because the body's in the way. But the inside of the arm matters less. So we're not going to be too worried about that. If we can't observe it, nobody else can observe it either, so it's not a big deal. So instead of my preferred 4 views, which would be the amount of views I would normally like to have, I now have 3, which is fine. I can get everything I need done with 3 views, especially when it comes to an arm, so there's no problem there. I start off by choosing one view, and for me, if possible, I'll choose the back of the elbow. My next view will then be 90 degrees to that view, which would be from the side. And this is the view where I'll need a stool, because I'm too short and the elbow is coming out from the body. Then there is the view from the inside of the elbow, which is 180 degrees from the first view that we established, or I guess you could call this the front view. Now from these 3 views, I can establish accurate contours while maintaining observation on equal terms with my model or reference. As long as my model or reference and sculpture is in the same position, of course. But as I said, we cannot be too laser focused on simply the contours in a 2-dimensional sense, because the arms are small and thin, and so we must establish movements in the contour as well right off the bat. It's best to not get tunnel vision here and work too much from one view, as you'll establish too much without any concern for the overall movement of contour. So switching views a bit more often when working on arms, maybe every 5 to 10 minutes, will be beneficial in order for us to properly observe and develop an understanding for how the contours of the arms need to move. We'll also notice overlaps while doing this, in the very same way that when we observe the pelvis from the side view, you'll often find that one buttocks is sticking out further than the other, because it's tense in a contrapposto, for example. And we'll find similar overlaps in the arms. So from the front view of the arm, when you're looking straight at the biceps, you'll be able to actually see, on most people anyway, the triceps, which are located at the back of the arm. The triceps will poke out wider than the biceps. The biceps is actually usually quite a narrow muscle. Knowing this will help us place the contours from the front of the arm, from the view of the front of the arm, further towards the back actually, where the triceps is located. So there is a correlation between knowledge of anatomy and being able to do this sort of work fast and efficiently. Now, can this be observed and then established without prior knowledge? Of course, but it's much harder and much slower. And so having at least a bare minimum of anatomy knowledge that you can lean on is very helpful and speeds up the process tremendously. The upper arm, which I'm working on here, is not as complex as the lower arm. In general, there are 3 major muscles that make up most of the surface anatomy on the upper arm. Those 3 are the biceps in the front, the triceps in the back, and the brachialis in between, the 2 visible from the side. An important note to make is that it's very helpful in creating a convincing arm if the anatomy connects each part. For example, the deltoid, which inserts much further down the arm than most people think. The bottom of the deltoid lines up more or less with the nipples, on men at least, if the arms are hanging relaxed by the side of the body. The deltoid inserts on the humerus, which is the bone of the upper arm, pretty much halfway down. Also notice how I focus on the nature of the muscles. For example, the deltoid, which has the feeling of coming from the back of the body at the top and sweeping forwards towards the bottom. This is the sort of discrete stuff that you'll never get from any anatomy book, and it's best learned, I think, by having observed many different deltoids for years. Each muscle has a certain character to it, and on some people, the character is different. In a piece like this, I'm trying to pick and choose things I like, in many ways stylizing the sculpture a bit, but it's not stylizing it to the extreme. None of this is really drawn from my imagination. It's not random in any fashion. It's all observed from life, and I've taken mental notes, and in some cases written notes, on what I like visually and what I do not like. And while observation from life has given me a large part of the vocabulary, figuring out what I like has also been about studying art history and looking deeper at what I find pleasing about a certain piece. Let me take an example. Notice how my biceps, or the sculpture's biceps, is quite short. The bump of the biceps doesn't travel from the top of the arm all the way down to the inside of the elbow. The bump ends about 3/4 of the way down the arm. Now on the back of the arm, the triceps has its bump at about 3/4 of the way up the arm, so the opposite. In other words, the peak of the biceps and the peak of the triceps are at an angle to each other. I've observed this feature from life in some people and some models, and here, on my sculpture here, I've exaggerated it for effect. Having the high points of the forms at an angle to each other means the eye is drawn up and down the arm. I didn't come up with this, by the way. This was taught to me, and you'll see similar patterns and again in many examples from art history, and in many sculptures. Even contemporary sculptures use this trick all the time in order to make sure that the viewer's eye travel up and down the figure and doesn't get stuck in one place, which is what tends to happen when you have high points at 90 degrees to each other, horizontal with the floor. It looks quite mechanical and quite unnatural, at least if there's a lot of it. The short section at the bottom of the arm, as the biceps head towards the elbow, so the last bottom 1/4, is an area of rest. So instead of bringing the biceps, the bump of the biceps, the fullness of the biceps, all the way down to the inside of the elbow, I have a short section of rest before we get the angle break at the inside of the elbow, where we go from upper arm to lower arm. So this area of rest is something that I try to get everywhere. This creates a much more pleasing yet complex contour and helps get the sculpture away from looking like it's super tense and super buff. It gives the forms room to breathe and it allows them to stand on their own. Michelangelo is famous for doing this, and you'll see it very, very clearly in his sculpture of Moses, in the arms of his sculpture, in Michelangelo's sculpture of Moses. Not only do I think this is useful in contour, but I think it's useful when it comes to the forms meeting, in the internal information meeting as well. With no area of rest between the forms, they become cluttered and very, very claustrophobic, and the sculpture looks super tense, like a child having a temper tantrum, or someone desperately trying to hold back a trip to the bathroom. A key thing to notice is that you can still have full, beautiful volumes without having your figure look like a steroid-using Gold's Gym member, and this is the way you do it. You need areas of rest in between the forms. The figure will appear lighter, and it's actually a lot easier on the eye this way as well. So, between each lump and bump on your figure, both when it comes to contour and internal information, it's a good idea to look for an area of rest, a small, flatter section that leads the eye into the next form. Don't have all your forms bumping up against each other, competing against each other. It won't look very good unless you intentionally are trying to make someone look like they are in desperate need of the toilet. Let's speak for a few seconds about the tools I'm employing to sculpt this. It's a pretty small assortment of tools with some wooden paddle tools from Tiranti and some Sculpture House rake tools. Link to both of those are in the description below if you want to check them out. Any wood paddle tool would do though, as long as you're comfortable with it and have gotten used to it. It's really all about getting used to the tools that you have. The rakes from Sculpture House are simply just loop tools really, with teeth or small notches cut into the wire so that they create a little bit of texture when you rake over the clay. Now I find that the teeth help the tool cut in a more even path through the clay, and it's a lot easier to use, I think. It creates a more even surface compared to a regular loop tool, in my opinion. As always, a lot of the building up of clay, the addition of material, I'm doing with my hands. You can do a lot of work with your hands, by the way, and trying to do so will make you a better sculptor, I think. Again, this is my opinion. And opinions vary greatly on this matter, actually. Personally, I find it keeps me from getting too specific, getting too narrowly focused, and it's much faster adding clay this way as well, compared to adding everything with your wooden paddle tool, one dot at a time. The rakes help blend the added clay together super fast, much faster than the wood tool can, and they also help even out the surface a little bit, round things out. The rakes are masters at getting a very organic result super fast, but it's important to keep in mind what the effect of such a tool is, what the tool actually does. The rake removes clay, and it does so by flattening out the peaks of your form. So for me, a rake is a means to an end, and not an end result that I'm after. The rake decreases the volume, and I'm not after really making a flat sculpture. While it's perhaps somewhat too philosophical for a video about sculpting arms, let me derail a little bit and talk about a philosophy that I have when it comes to sculpture. My aim with sculpture is to displace as much space as possible. I'm creating something that is going to occupy the same space as we humans and everything else in this world, at least everything else that we know of, live in, and I'm going to do my best making sure that it's not flat. If I wanted to make something flat, I would make a drawing. But I'm after displacing space, and rakes do not support that goal as they remove clay. Having said that, however, I do use rakes quite a bit, and probably a lot more than most of my fellow FAA graduates, students and instructors. And I prefer it as a tool to bring forms together and reach an organic looking surface very fast without having to fiddle around for hours with a wood tool. At the end of the day, I don't really think the tool matters that much. Only the end result matter, and if the rakes get me closer, faster, I'll use it. Over the top of the raked clay, however, I'll always, almost always, add more clay, more volume. The rake is also fantastic at adjusting contours, frankly, and making sure that the contours are not jagged, but crisp and clean. Now, if you can imagine, in your mind, that the sculpture exists on a two-dimensional level, not a three-dimensional level, but a two-dimensional one like a drawing, and the contours of your sculpture are similar to the outline in a pencil drawing. A fuzzy or shaky outline is not going to do your drawing any good. It's going to look amateur. And the same thing is true for the outline or contour of your sculpture. So spend some time cleaning up the contours, making them nice and crisp, like thin pencil lines. We've spoken about contrasting material in other videos, and if you keep the contours crisp where there is skin and more jagged or fuzzy where there's hair, you can sell the illusion of different materials through contrast in the quality of your contours. Think of it like line quality in a pencil drawing. While we can't and shouldn't attempt to create atmosphere through line quality, which is something that is quite common in drawing, in sculpture we can create contrast to sell the illusion of different materials through line quality or contour quality, if you will. The last tool I'll mention was barely used, barely seen, but it's still a very useful tool, and that is a pair of calipers. Now, we call it a pair of calipers, but a pair of calipers is really just one caliper. So I'm not entirely sure why it's called a pair of calipers. Either way, calipers will help you make sure the arms are the same length, which is of course important. Making the arms two different lengths is actually a more common mistake than you would think. In my third year at the Florence Academy of Art, I messed up the length of a forearm on a 10-week project, and I only realized it in the last week because you couldn't really see both the arms at the same time in this project. I did end up correcting my mistake, but that was not a fun repair job at all, especially considering there was only 1 week left and I didn't really know if it was going to work out or not. This happens more often than you would think, and a few minutes with the calipers could have saved you, or me, a lot of work trying to fix a pretty stupid mistake. This happens often enough as well with the length of bones, and especially with the length of clavicles. The clavicle is a bone, and so the length of it will never change. It's always attached to the same place on either end, and while there certainly is movement, because the shoulder can move up and down and forward and backwards, the two clavicles will always remain the same length. Anytime there is a bone involved, make sure there is symmetry, or at least something pretty damn close to symmetry, so that you sell the illusion of bone as opposed to something more organic like muscle, which can have a lot of asymmetries. Lastly, always consider action. What action is the arm you are sculpting performing? In my case, the figure of Kronos will be holding a young woman up in the air, and though she'll be much smaller than him, it would still be quite the effort to lift this woman up and hold her in midair. Your model, if you're working from life, will only be able to provide you with reference for an action like this for a very short amount of time, as tensing your muscles or putting a massive strain on your muscles and holding them very still is not very easy to do for an extended period of time. So in my case, the muscles that will be doing the majority of the work on the right arm, I'm considering action right now, would be the shoulder, as the arm is extended and lifted upwards and forwards. On the left arm, it would be the biceps. Considering this when sculpting and try to incorporate details that sell the illusion of strain in areas where the figure would be straining in order to complete the action that he or she is performing. The right shoulder should appear sharper with darker transitions, and more visible anatomy compared to the left because it's under stress or exerting force. The biceps on the left arm should appear shorter, obviously. When we tense the biceps, it shortens up and it compresses, it bulges more, and this should stand in contrast to the one on the right arm. In addition to action, there's also gravity to consider. When a muscle is not tense, it will be subject to a more obvious effect of gravity. And this is another element you can use to make the muscles seem relaxed. For example, the biceps on the right arm will be hanging down. If you can imagine a cross-section of this muscle, it would look more like a sagging water balloon. Now that's of course a bit of an exaggeration, but this is the effect that we are going for. If the same cross-section of the biceps was an even cylinder, it would appear as if the muscle was either tense or not affected by gravity at all. Including little things like the effects of gravity on the body in your sculpture is going to make a huge difference in how lifelike it appears. And if the goal is to create a sculpture that seems like it could be alive, which is part of my goal in order to make my work as relatable and visceral as possible, making sure that the sculpture is affected by the same forces that affect the natural world is important and can only serve to create a stronger illusion of life. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did and want to learn sculpture from me or just support the channel, check out my Patreon page. I give feedback and critiques on people's work, and we can talk about whatever you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. And right now, there is exclusive sculpting content on my Patreon. The first series we have embarked on is the Beginner's Guide to Figure Sculpture. I'm super excited to finally be creating exclusive content for Patreon, and I hope you will be too, and we'll take a look. The link to my Patreon page is in the description below the video. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for a new video next Thursday. Hit the subscribe button and the bell to be notified whenever a new video comes out. If you enjoyed the video, click the like button and share it with your friends and family. It helps me out a lot. Thank you for watching, stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.